In the middle of September, I went camping on a whim. I kinda decided on the spur of the moment to take one final journey to Minnesota's northern woods before winter arrived and put everything on hold for a few months. Living only a few hours south, I had visited these woods numerous times, so it was my go-to spot whenever I wanted to camp or go trekking for the weekend. I was at a small isolated lake. The fact that Minnesota is recognized for having thousands of lakes dispersed throughout the northern part of the state means that you can frequently locate smaller lakes with no one else nearby, which is something I truly like about the area. Having one for myself was always fantastic. I kind of made this place my favorite place to camp after discovering it a couple years back. This vacation was entirely unnoticed for the first 3 days. Nothing took place. I simply set my camp and relished the solitude of an empty lake. Swimming in the lake, strolling through the woods, and unwinding in the solitude. I didn't see anything that would make me feel any less secure. On the 4th day, however, I discovered scattered tracks all around my campground as I woke up at dawn and got out of my tent. Some go all the way up to the front of my tent, not just in the vicinity. It wasn't from me, and they weren't there before. They obviously came by when I was sleeping, and the prints were from heavy boots, which I didn't even own. Knowing that I had a visitor in the middle of the night made me feel really uneasy right away. I walked around the lake and through the forest for the entire morning, searching for any other indications that somebody was there. I couldn't find anything. I wasn't really worried about anyone else coming here. The reason for this was that they showed there in the middle of the night and explored the area where I had obviously been put up, even approaching my tent directly, which was quite unsettling. After that, they simply vanished without leaving any evidence, not even setting a camp nearby. It simply didn't add up. For the remainder of the day, I kept my eyes open. I considered leaving, but cutting short my year's last camping vacation was the last thing I wanted to do. And I didn't see any indications that the person was still there. It was as though he had simply arrived and departed. Perhaps he didn't want to share the lake with anybody else and was hoping the spot would be empty. In any case, the day passed somewhat slowly. I did little but lingered at the campsite. I waited for myself to grow weary around the campfire as the sun began to fall. I had mostly stopped worrying about it. I continued to find it strange and nearly incomprehensible. I wouldn't receive any answers anyway, and thinking about it would only make me feel more uneasy. It was a rather peaceful night. It was difficult not to feel at ease with the wind, the bonfire, and the lake's flowing water. Cozy in my winter jacket, I sank back into my chair. I let myself go off to sleep in the chair since I didn't want to get up even though my eyes were getting heavy. I don't think I ever truly fell asleep completely, which is why I say half asleep. I believe I was largely conscious even though my eyes were closed. Then I heard someone calling my name. My eyes sprung open and I sat motionless for a while. I whirled my head in every way. Everything appeared to be just as it had been, and the forest was silent. My heart was pounding and my eyes were still wide open. I couldn't tell if I had heard my name called out or if it was just a fleeting dream. There seemed to be no way because it was so absurd and unfeasible. But it seemed so genuine. I shouted hello after a minute and heard my voice reverberate over the forest, but nobody answered. Given that I was partly asleep, I suppose it was only a brief dream, or perhaps one of those hallucinations associated with sleep paralysis. I attempted to reassure myself in this way. However, my heart began to race right away, waking me up. And that uneasy feeling persisted. I was unable to get rid of it. I think I sat there for another 30 minutes before my eyes started to feel a little heavy once more. However, I heard it again this time before I had closed them or even gotten close to sleeping. From the shadows of the forest, a voice called out my name. The way he called my name sounded like he was pleading with me to come outside or asking for my assistance, even though I didn't recognize the voice. I got up and gazed at the forest. His voice called my name once more. He didn't seem to be that far away. My head was obviously spinning. How did this stranger in the forest find out about my name? Furthermore, why was he out in the dark? After taking a few steps toward the trees and out to the edge of the light, I reluctantly yelled out, "Hello," again. After a 15-second silence, all I heard was the person shouting my name for the 4th time. There seemed to be a serious problem here. The way he was attempting to entice me to venture into the woods where it was actually completely dark. No way. Despite my curiosity and temptation to find out more, I was listening to his voice. I retreated a short distance and began gathering my belongings. I wasn't, but I was packing so quickly because I kept pausing to listen and look around. It was also difficult to take things down in the dark, because the campfire was now reduced to blazing ashes, but I felt as though time was running out. As the light from the campfire dimmed, the voice continued to draw nearer, and occasionally footsteps could be heard crunching nearby leaves. It was terrifying because whomever was out there had to know what they were doing. I put on my backpack and pulled out the flashlight once I had everything packed. After giving it some thought, I concluded that it might be best to leave it off and try to blend in with the woods, where the darkness would provide me with enough cover to avoid him and make sure he couldn't follow me. I abruptly stopped talking and ran away from the voice. As I was walking away, the man yelled out once again, and I didn't turn around until I was farther away. The warm glow of the campfire's embers was just visible to me, and there was the tiniest outline of a figure standing right behind it. I couldn't figure out anything specific, but there was something very strange about him. I heard the man's voice calling my name once more as I turned around and ran more into the woods. Suddenly, it was just me in the silent, dark, and empty woods once more. To put it mildly, the hike out of there was nerve-wracking. However, I can't even begin to express how relieved I am to have escaped those woods and returned to my car. Describe. I considered phoning the police, but to be honest, I feared I would sound insane. I think a guy is stalking me and yelling my name in the woods. What on earth would police do about that? I still have no idea what actually transpired out there that evening, nearly 3 years later. A part of me feels disappointed that I didn't approach the speaker to see who it was and how they knew my name, even though I know it's crazy. However, I am aware that if I had, that might have been my final choice. I'd like stay anonymous, however, this was a few years ago. I was employed for a tiny independent company, and one of Cameron was one of my coworkers. Since we were both hired at the same time and had desks next to one another, we immediately clicked. It goes without saying that we had a wonderful working friendship and talked a lot. We didn't hang out outside of work, but since we were both interested in hiking and other outdoor activities, we frequently talked about going camping together throughout the workday. However, I didn't think it would actually happen until I arrived at work one day and saw that Cameron wasn't there and his desk was empty. It became out that he had been fired for reasons that I was obviously not allowed to know. That same day I received a text from him asking if we could get together after work and go on that camping trip we used to speak about. To be honest, I felt sorry for him. I accepted his offer, realizing that I would probably never see him again if I didn't. How horrible could it be, really? After making the arrangements, we got together a week later at a forest trailhead, 2 hours west of the city. I was genuinely delighted to see him, and he appeared to be quite glad and excited to see me. However, I immediately sensed that he wasn't the same person as he was at work. It was just something I noticed, not something to be concerned about. We began walking down the trail and conversed the entire way. I attempted to gently inquire as to why he was no longer employed at the office, but he sidestepped the topic. It was a little odd to see him becoming more restrained because at work he was generally quite open about everything, possibly too open, but I figured he had just made an embarrassing error or something. Nevertheless, we arrived at the campsite, erected both tents, and then prepared lunch. After we finished our meal, Cameron immediately got up and muttered, "Be right back," before disappearing into the woods. He spoke in a way that suggested he had somewhere to be, which was illogical in this context. Why don't you just state that you were going for a walk or something? I lounged at the campsite for 10 minutes before he returned. I chose to ignore it since he remained silent and pretended nothing had happened. Pass over my head. We spoke for a little while longer. I'm not sure, maybe an hour. He then carried out the same action. He promised to return and left for the woods, but this time he did so in the midst of a conversation. He abruptly stopped talking, just stared out into the trees and walked away. I looked where he had looked first, but I couldn't find anything. I felt pretty strange about it this time. Unsettled nearly once again. He returned 10 minutes later. I asked him where he had gone this time, and after giving it some thought, he simply replied, "Nowhere." Not a single explanation. Once more, I simply let it go. A few odd things wouldn't completely alter my opinion of Cameron, because I had been speaking with him almost daily for the past 6 months. We continued our conversation by the campfire before retiring to our tents to sleep. I had no trouble falling asleep because I was rather exhausted, but I was awake in the middle of the night. I can still clearly recall how calm it was when I opened my eyes. Just the gentle sounds of the woodland. I opened my tent and took a quick look around. I'm still not sure why I woke up. I immediately noticed that Cameron was not in his tent and that it was open. I searched the entire campsite, but I couldn't find him, though I couldn't find a light anywhere in the trees. I did note that the flashlight was missing. Cameron. I repeatedly called his name, but he never returned my calls. I spent a full minute sitting outside my tent, surveying my surroundings and waiting for him to return, when I began to hear sounds coming from the trees. It sounded like conversation. Quietly, two persons exchange words. "Are you out there, Cameron?" The woodland was silent once more when the conversation ceased. After a tense 30 seconds, Cameron cautiously made his way from the trees toward the campground. He attempted to conceal his tight expression with a shaky smile. "Who was out there?" I asked him. "No one," he responded after pausing, although as he was speaking, some footfall could be heard coming from the trees. I'm sure he heard it as well. I repeatedly glanced at him and inquired as to who might be out there. I was beginning to feel really uncomfortable. Nevertheless, he responded, "No one." We silently stared at each other for a tense 15 or 20 seconds, while slow, quiet footsteps came from the shadows. I suddenly just ran down the trail, leaving everything behind as my adrenaline swelled up. I heard Cameron and another guy conversing as I ran, but I didn't turn around. I continued until I reached my car. Thank goodness I had my phone and keys with me and we drove apart. I spent the remainder of that evening driving home and wondering what in the world went wrong. In the end, I sent Cameron a text, but it never made it. I was already barred by him. I hadn't spoken to him since that evening. I consider myself quite fortunate to have escaped, but I have no idea who else was out there or what he and Cameron were up to. I traveled to my hometown in early November of last year, primarily to visit some old acquaintances, but also to spend the week at a lovely vacation cabin, just a lovely rental in the woods. My hometown was small, primarily encircled by forest, and had many beautiful vistas and camping spots close by. Although I had never gone camping before, I had done a lot of study and was eager to start. After gathering all the equipment I would need, I decided that going camping for the first time in a familiar forest outside of my hometown would be ideal. I could ease into the activity and felt safer that way. There was a trail that led to a little campground behind the rental cabin, which is why I chose it. I reasoned that if something went wrong, I could simply return to the cabin and everything would be fine. It seemed like a risk-free way to have fun on my first trip. I hung out with my pals for the first few days, and then I spent another day relaxing at the cabin and getting ready. At last, I made my way to the campground. The hike lasted just 1 hour. I spent the first 10 minutes concentrating more on making sure everything was going according to plan and adjusting my bag. After everything was in order, and I had nothing more to worry about, I began to experience an odd sensation. The sensation of being observed from the treetops. I assumed I was just anxious because it was my first time being by myself in a forest. However, the emotion didn't truly go away as I believed it would. I would always have this terrible, hollow feeling when I looked out into the woods beyond the trail. It felt like a clear indication to leave the area. I didn't listen, though. I persevered, battling those emotions all the way to the campsite. If it weren't for a few leftovers from earlier campers, I honestly wouldn't have considered the tiny plot of grass to be a campsite. Given how disorganized and poorly kept it was, this location was undoubtedly not very established. Even so, I felt a little better being off the track and in a wider space. I was comfortable enough to stay. I began setting up my tent and unpacked. Since this was my first time, I was paying close attention to the detailed directions to make sure I did it correctly. It took about 15 minutes, which wasn't too bad in my opinion. A man showed up at the campsite just as I was covering it with the last rain cover. He was tall and appeared to be in his mid-20s. He waved and smiled strangely when I turned to face him. It was odd because he smiled normally, but the rest of his face remained still, as if he had a blank face and simply grinned with his mouth and teeth. He appeared at a campsite just after me, which I found to be a really strange and bizarre coincidence. Didn't appear to be utilized frequently. What did I know, though? I kept going about my business, organizing everything in my neighborhood, removing everything and gathering wood to start a fire. A tiny fire ring that must have been constructed ages ago already existed. The dude set up his own tent nearby as I was doing all of it. Strangely enough, though, that was it. He only brought that. I believed he was carrying a real backpack when I saw him approach, but it was actually just a sling bag with the tent inside. He had nothing at all, not even food or a sleeping bag. His tent was primarily made of mesh and lacked a rain cover, so I can be certain of that. And the man did nothing but sit there. Every time I happened to glance over, I felt uncomfortable because he would look at me right away, forcing me to hastily turn my head away. I couldn't help but grow increasingly uncomfortable with this guy after gathering all the sticks and finally having some time to just sit there and do nothing. I had a strong suspicion that there was something seriously wrong with him. And the idea of being there by myself with him at night was beginning to really get on my nerves as the sun began to set. I concluded it wasn't worth living here while I felt this way, especially with my renter, even though I detested myself for it. Hut not too far away. It might even be possible to arrive before the sun completely sets. As soon as I began packing, the man left his tent. He was standing next to it, and even though he was trying not to show it, it was clear that he was observing me. His entire face was now rigid and almost irritated, and his smile had vanished. I just threw everything in my backpack and hoped it would zip up without even trying to organize it. I knew I had to move quickly since sunlight was just beginning to emerge from the tops of the trees when I was finally ready to leave. However, I hoped that meant the man was staying because he hadn't put down his tent. I began to move. I continued to check, ensuring he didn't follow me from behind. Every time I looked back for the first several minutes, I was relieved to see an empty track. However, after 10 minutes or so, I glanced around once more and spotted him. Even though the trail wasn't exactly straight, I could see him approaching me from behind the woods. I became numb. I was appalled. I accelerated down the trail by quickening my pace. I don't think he was aware that I spotted him, based on what I could see, and I felt better when the sun went down. I managed to return to the rental cabin, shutting all the doors and tossing my suitcase inside. After that, I stood at the rear window for 15 minutes, gazing at the trees as the sun completely sank, leaving them dead and dark. I was still looking out the window when there was a loud knock on the front door behind me. But it wasn't just a casual knock. He kept pounding his fist against the door. I contacted the cops in a panic. I honestly couldn't tell if Guy was trying to smash the door or just knocking incredibly hard, and I was too afraid to look at all. The man paused for a moment as soon as I began speaking on the phone. I was aware that he was paying attention. Then I heard his footsteps running around the cabin, and I think I heard a... Before his footsteps disappeared into the woods, he made a couple thumps while attempting to open one of the windows. It remained silent until 2 officers showed up 20 minutes later. The officers agreed that the individual appeared to have some extremely dangerous intentions based on all I told them. But it wasn't so simple to find him. I was only aware of his appearance. That evening, they conducted a brief search using torches, but they were unable to locate him. He had also left his tent at the campsite. I genuinely have no idea what might have occurred that evening. I still find it hard to forgive myself for not immediately following my instincts. Everything that occurred that evening might have been avoided. I should have trusted my instincts as soon as I began to feel uneasy about that forest.